Hey guys, tonight we begin with a problem that could turn an ordinary winter evening on the American frontier into a quiet emergency. The woodpile was almost empty, the temperature was falling, and the nearest useful stand of timber might be miles away. On the Great Plains, this was not a rare mistake. In many places, trees were scarce enough that settlers could not treat firewood as an unlimited background resource. A stove needed fuel for cooking, for drying wet clothes, and sometimes simply for keeping a room survivable. So families learned an uncomfortable frontier lesson. When wood disappeared, almost anything that could burn became valuable. Dried buffalo dung, cow chips, corncobs, twisted hay, tough prairie grasses, even the design of the house itself became part of the heating system. The famous pioneer story is usually about chopping more wood. The more interesting story begins when there was almost no wood left to chop. If you enjoy these ordinary survival problems more than another parade of presidents and generals, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and comment with the frontier problem you would least want to face yourself. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand is that running out of firewood meant something different depending on where a family had settled. In wooded parts of the East, or in river valleys with dependable timber, an empty woodpile might mean poor planning, bad weather, illness, or simply that nobody wanted to go outside with an axe. But farther onto the plains, scarcity could be built into the landscape. An emigrant moving west along the Platte River could travel through country where grass seemed endless and trees looked almost rationed by nature. That changed the meaning of fuel. A branch was no longer just a branch. It was breakfast, hot water, dry socks, and perhaps several hours of warmth. Travelers learned to collect wood when they found it rather than when they happened to need it. Yet wagons already carried food, tools, bedding, spare parts, clothing, weapons, and people. You could not casually load half a forest onto an ox wagon. Fuel therefore became a daily logistics problem. Find it, carry it, protect it from rain, and burn it carefully. Then the plains offered a solution that initially offended plenty of newcomers. Dung. Not fresh dung, obviously. The useful material was old, thoroughly dried bison manure scattered across grazing country. Emigrants called it buffalo chips. Indigenous peoples of the plains had long used dried bison dung as fuel, and newcomers adopted the same practical answer to the same environmental problem. By the middle of the 19th century, trail accounts mentioned buffalo chips so routinely that they become almost mundane. The National Park Service notes that when wood was unavailable, emigrants on the western trails fueled fires with them. That simple sentence hides one of the great adjustments of overland travel. Respectable families who might once have regarded animal manure as something to keep out of the kitchen were now gathering it specifically to put under the cooking pot. The material worked because the bison had already done much of the processing. They ate prairie grasses, digested them, and left behind fibrous patties that dried in the sun. Once properly dry, those patties caught fire readily and produced useful heat. William Temple Hornaday, writing about the American bison in the 19th century, described thoroughly dried chips as excellent fuel on treeless plains, easy to ignite, hot, relatively low in smoke, but consumed quickly. That last detail mattered. Buffalo chips could save supper. They were less impressive if your ambition was to sit beside a roaring fireplace until dawn. So gathering enough was work. Elizabeth Dixon Smith, travelling in 1847, recorded seeing immense numbers of buffalo and having to use their dung for fuel. She estimated that a person could gather a bushel in a minute and that several bushels made a good fire. Whether every patch of trail was quite that generous is another matter, but the basic labour is clear. When camp was made, somebody had to go out and collect fuel before cooking could begin. Children often did it, women did it, men did it. The task was humble enough to become a frontier joke, but jokes do not make a cooking fire optional. One emigrant recalled that as wagons circled for camp, people hurried out after the best chips, sometimes competing for large dry pieces. The absurdity is easy to enjoy from a warm room. After walking beside a wagon all day, you reached camp and discovered that dinner depended on winning a race for dried manure. Weather made the system less amusing. Dry chips were useful. Wet chips were a different proposition. Rain could turn an easy fire into a smoky frustration, and a traveller who had failed to gather fuel before a storm might be unable to cook at all. This encouraged a frontier habit that mattered with every substitute fuel. Think one meal ahead. Dry fuel was stored when possible. Settlers who had permanent homes could accumulate chips in sheds or other protected places, instead of gambling each evening on what lay outside. And buffalo chips were only one answer. As bison disappeared from much of the settled plains, cattle supplied cow chips. In Nebraska and neighboring prairie country, families also burned hay. Not loose handfuls tossed hopefully into a stove, but grass twisted into dense ropes or compact bundles so that it burned more slowly and could be fed into the fire in a controlled way. Historical accounts from Nebraska described families facing winters with hay as their principal fuel, while also storing hard buffalo chips in dry places. Imagine the difference from the familiar picture of a pioneer hearth. There may be no heroic stack of split oak against the wall. Instead, the winter reserve can look like agricultural leftovers, dried dung, twisted grass, perhaps corncobs after harvest, and whatever scraps of actual wood have been judged too valuable to waste early. This also explains why the house itself mattered. Sod houses were not merely cheap shelters made by people who lacked lumber. Their thick earth and grass walls offered substantial insulation. That did not magically make a winter warm, and a sod house could have plenty of other problems, but thick walls slowed the exchange of heat with the outside air. When every armful of fuel represented labour, distance, or scarcity, conserving heat was another form of fuel gathering. The survival strategy, then, was rarely one clever substitute. It was a system. Burn the strange fuel, store it dry, reduce the space you had to heat, cook efficiently, save real wood for jobs where it mattered most, gather tomorrow's fuel before tomorrow arrived. And this is where the pioneer woodpile becomes more interesting than it first appears. The crisis was not solved by toughness alone. You cannot grit your teeth hard enough to make an oak tree grow on open prairie. People survived by changing their standards for what counted as fuel, and once they did, the landscape that had seemed almost empty of fire began to look very different. Once a family accepted that almost anything dry and fibrous might become fuel, the next problem was learning that different fuels behave very differently inside a stove. Wood was forgiving. A good split log could burn for a respectable stretch of time, settle into a bed of coals, and continue releasing heat after the visible flames had dropped. Prairie grass did nothing of the sort. Hay could flare quickly and vanish almost as quickly. Cornstalks and corncobs could produce useful heat, but they demanded attention. Dried manure could cook a meal surprisingly well, yet it did not necessarily give a family the long, slow, overnight warmth they wanted in January. This meant that replacing firewood was not simply a matter of throwing something else into the stove. The entire rhythm of household work changed. A stove burning fast fuel had to be fed more often. Someone had to be awake. Someone had to notice when the heat was falling. Someone had to carry another bundle from storage, open the stove, push in the fuel, control the draft, and make sure sparks did not escape into a room built from dry wood, grass, or other very combustible materials. During severe weather, this could continue through the night. The romantic version of pioneer winter often gives us a peaceful cabin, a glowing stove, and a family safely tucked beneath quilts while snow gathers outside. The less comfortable reality is that warmth could require repeated maintenance. If the fuel burned quickly enough, the person tending the fire might sleep in intervals rather than through the night. And sometimes the goal was not to keep the entire house warm. That expectation deserves some attention, because modern heating quietly changes how we imagine the past. Today, people often think of a house as a volume of air that should remain at approximately the same comfortable temperature in every occupied room. Frontier households could not always afford that idea. Heat was concentrated. The kitchen or main living room might be the warmest part of the house because that was where the stove stood. Bedrooms could be bitterly cold. Water left in the wrong place might freeze. Frost could form inside windows. Beds were not necessarily warmed by the surrounding room so much as by layers of insulation around the person sleeping in them. That is where blankets, quilts, feather beds, heavy clothing, curtains, rugs, and even sleeping arrangements became part of the fuel economy. Every bit of heat that did not need to be produced was fuel that did not need to be gathered. Families closed doors to rooms that were not being used. They blocked drafts. They hung fabric where cold air entered. They placed beds away from the worst exterior exposure when the structure allowed it. Several people could sleep in the same room, allowing their own body heat to contribute a little to the enclosed space. And people simply tolerated temperatures indoors that many modern households would consider unacceptable. That point matters. Pioneers did not possess a secret technique that allowed a handful of cow chips to transform a freezing cabin into a permanently warm modern living room. Often, they survived by redefining what warm enough meant. Warm enough to keep fingers working. Warm enough to prepare food. Warm enough that the youngest children could sleep safely beneath heavy bedding. Warm enough to thaw something that had frozen. Warm enough to get through another night. Comfort was desirable. Survival came first. Clothing, therefore, remained important even indoors. Wool was especially valuable because of its insulating properties, while multiple layers trapped air around the body. Socks, shawls, caps, and other garments were not necessarily removed merely because a person had crossed the threshold into the house. A winter household could, in effect, shrink around its heat source. The farther you moved from the stove, the colder the world became. This was one reason cooking was such an important part of winter heating. The same fire could perform more than one job. If fuel was scarce, burning it only to heat empty air made little sense when that heat could also boil water, cook beans, bake bread, fry meat, warm washing water, or dry damp clothing nearby. The household tried to extract several benefits from one flame. Food itself could be organized around fuel availability. Meals that required long hours of intense heat were more expensive in fuel than quick preparations. A pot could sometimes be allowed to simmer near a lower part of the stove rather than over the strongest fire. Residual heat could continue working after active cooking ended. Even ashes had uses. A bed of hot coals protected beneath ash could make restarting a fire easier than building one completely from scratch. This was enormously important before modern matches became cheap and universally available. Earlier households treated fire as something worth preserving. If the stove went completely cold, ignition required tinder, kindling, and a reliable source of flame or spark. Keeping an ember alive could save time and effort the next morning. But preserving coals became harder when the available fuel burned rapidly and left poor embers. Again, wood had an advantage. A dense hardwood fire could leave a substantial coal bed. Grass and other substitutes might disappear with much less generosity. So whenever a household possessed a limited supply of good wood, it could be used strategically rather than evenly. A few pieces might be saved for nighttime, or for starting fires, or for the coldest weather, or for moments when somebody was sick and steady heat mattered more than usual. Scarcity forced families to think about fuel almost the way they thought about food. You did not merely ask, "Do we have some?" You asked how much remained, how quickly it was being consumed, what weather might arrive next, and when another supply could realistically be obtained. Then there was the problem of obtaining that supply. On wooded frontiers, cutting fuel was exhausting but conceptually simple. You found suitable timber, felled it, cut it into manageable lengths, split it, hauled it home, and allowed it to season. On open prairie, the search could become much stranger. Settlers sometimes travelled considerable distances to reach timber along creeks and rivers. The valleys of the plains often carried ribbons of trees through otherwise open country, making them valuable not only for water but for construction and fuel. Those trees were therefore under pressure from everyone who needed posts, roofs, furniture, fencing, wagon repairs, and firewood. A tree could solve many problems. That was precisely why burning it casually could feel wasteful. Good lumber might be more valuable as part of a roof than as an evening's heat. Straight timber might become a door frame, a wagon component, a fence post, or a tool handle. Even smaller branches had value if the nearest replacement stood miles away. Nothing about the landscape encouraged extravagance. So settlers scavenged. Dead branches mattered. Driftwood along rivers mattered. Scraps left from building mattered. Broken wooden objects could eventually move down the hierarchy from useful possession to repair material to kindling. A damaged crate might have one more life. A shattered handle might have one more life. A piece of lumber too short for construction could still contain several minutes of heat. This mentality reached beyond wood. Corn-producing regions generated enormous quantities of cobs after the kernels were removed. Cobs were already dry, easy to handle, and available close to the farmstead. They could be burned in stoves, particularly when combined with other fuels. Cornstalks could also enter the fuel supply, so could sunflower stalks in some places. Straw, brush, and other agricultural residues became useful precisely because they were already present. The farm was producing fuel almost accidentally, and that was the deeper transformation. A newcomer could look across a winter prairie and see a treeless landscape. An experienced household could look at the same place and see layers of stored energy. Grass in the field, dung on the ground, cobs near the crib, stalks after harvest, deadwood along a creek, a few precious logs under shelter, heat trapped inside thick sod walls, quilts stacked on a bed, a stove placed where one fire could cook, dry, boil, and warm at the same time. Survival did not come from discovering one perfect replacement for firewood. It came from refusing to depend on one fuel at all. And when winter became severe enough, that flexibility could become the difference between an uncomfortable household and a genuinely dangerous one. Because the hardest test was not an ordinary cold evening when everyone had time to gather another basket of chips. It was the storm that arrived before the fuel did. A serious winter storm changed the arithmetic of fuel almost immediately. On an ordinary day, a settler might be able to walk to a creek bottom, collect fallen branches, haul a load from a distant timber claim, gather chips from the prairie, or twist another supply of hay. During a blizzard, every one of those options could disappear at once. Visibility collapsed, snow buried familiar landmarks, roads vanished, animals became difficult or dangerous to move. A source of fuel that was technically only 2 miles away might as well have been 50. That was why the size of the woodpile mattered less than the number of cold days it could survive. Families who had lived through several winters learned to distrust mild weather. A warm afternoon in December did not mean January would be forgiving. Fuel gathered before the snow arrived was safer than fuel waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. But preparation was imperfect. Illness could prevent cutting. An early storm could trap a household before enough fuel had been stored. A family arriving late in the season might have barely finished its shelter before winter closed around it. A crop failure could reduce the agricultural waste normally burned for heat. Even a well-prepared household could miscalculate when an unusually long cold spell consumed fuel faster than expected. Then rationing began. A family might stop heating parts of the house entirely. Furniture and daily activities moved closer to the stove. Doors remained shut. Children were kept near the warmest room. Work that could be postponed was postponed. Anything requiring additional fire was reconsidered. Laundry, for example, was not a trivial winter chore. Washing clothes required water, and water often had to be heated. Wet garments then had to dry somewhere. Both steps could consume precious heat. During a fuel shortage, cleanliness could become a matter of priorities rather than routine. People did what circumstances allowed. Bathing presented the same problem. A large tub of warm water represented an extraordinary amount of heat when every handful of fuel had to be gathered by somebody. The idea that an entire family would frequently heat large quantities of water for comfortable baths belongs more naturally to later households with abundant fuel or modern plumbing. On the frontier, warmth had competing demands. Food needed heat. People needed heat. Water needed heat. Clothes needed drying. And livestock might demand attention outside regardless of the temperature. The stove could not solve everything at once. Storms also exposed an uncomfortable weakness in substitute fuels. Many of them required protection before they became useful. Hay had to remain reasonably dry. Dung burned best after thorough drying. Cornstalks and other plant material became far less cooperative when wet. A household with a mountain of fuel lying beneath snow did not necessarily possess a mountain of immediately usable fuel. Storage, therefore, became part of survival. Barns, sheds, lean-tos, cellars, covered stacks and protected corners around a dwelling could preserve material that otherwise became difficult to ignite. Families did not need sophisticated engineering to understand the principle. Dry fuel was valuable. Wet fuel was labor. Sometimes the difference could be felt in the smoke. Poor fuel, insufficient draft, damp material, and badly maintained chimneys could fill interiors with smoke and soot. A stove was more efficient than an open fireplace in many circumstances, but it still required a functioning flue. Chimneys and stovepipes had to carry combustion gases safely outside. That introduced another winter danger: fire. The same household, desperate to preserve heat, was often surrounded by material that could burn extremely well. Wooden roofs, timber walls, dry hay, stored straw, clothing near a stove, bedding, fuel stacked close enough to remain convenient. A glowing ember in the wrong place could convert a heating problem into a catastrophe. Chimney fires were especially frightening because soot and creosote could accumulate inside flues. If deposits ignited, temperatures could become intense enough to damage the chimney or spread fire to the structure around it. For isolated families, there was no professional fire department racing across the prairie. A burning house might have to be fought with whatever water, snow, tools, and neighbours were available. And during deep winter, losing the house meant losing shelter at precisely the moment shelter mattered most. So heating involved a peculiar balance. Keep the fire alive, but not too alive. Feed it often, but do not waste fuel. Dry things near it, but not close enough to ignite. Close drafts, but do not create a room full of smoke. Preserve heat, but still maintain enough ventilation for safe combustion. The frontier stove demanded respect because it was simultaneously one of the most useful and one of the most dangerous objects in the house. Children learned this early. They might also become part of the fuel system themselves. A child large enough to carry a basket could gather chips, bring in cobs, collect small branches, or help move twisted hay. Frontier childhood contained play, affection, school, and imagination, but household survival did not always wait for adulthood. Children contributed because families needed many hands. The work could be repetitive. Carry fuel in, carry ash out, bring water, close the door quickly, fetch another bundle, check the animals, return with frozen fingers, warm them, go back outside. Nothing about this routine required dramatic heroism. That is partly why it disappears behind larger frontier legends. There were no cheering crowds when a 12-year-old brought in enough cow chips to cook supper. But survival is often built from unimpressive tasks repeated before they become emergencies. Neighbours could make those tasks easier. The popular image of the pioneer family standing completely alone against the wilderness contains some truth in especially isolated settlements. But communities mattered enormously. People borrowed tools, shared labour, exchanged food, helped during illness, and sometimes supplied fuel when another household was in trouble. A neighbour with a wagon and a team could transform the problem of distant timber. Several people cutting together could accomplish what one exhausted person could not. Someone with an unusually large supply might share enough to carry another family through a storm. That generosity was not merely sentimental. Frontier communities understood that misfortune moved around. Today, your neighbour had no wood. Next month, your horse might be injured. Next spring, your roof might need rebuilding. Mutual assistance was a form of insurance before formal systems of insurance could reach many isolated places. Yet there were limits. A settlement experiencing the same blizzard faced the same shortage together. One family could not endlessly give away fuel needed by its own children. When cold lasted long enough, private generosity encountered physical scarcity. At that point, households reached deeper into the inventory of burnable things. Broken furniture could become fuel. Scrap lumber could become fuel. Old fencing might become fuel if preserving the fence mattered less than preserving warmth. Packing boxes, discarded boards, and fragments saved from construction acquired sudden value. People sometimes burned materials they would normally have repaired or reused. This was a grim threshold, because frontier households were already cultures of repair. A useful wooden object was not casually thrown away. Nails might be pulled out and saved. Boards might be reused. Handles could be reshaped. Containers could find several purposes before finally wearing out. Burning something useful meant admitting that tomorrow's material needs mattered less than tonight's temperature. The choice sounds small until you imagine making it repeatedly. Do we burn this board now? Or save it to repair the shed? Do we use the last good wood tonight? Or gamble that tomorrow will be colder? Do we send someone outside for more fuel while the storm is strengthening? Do we let the fire fall and depend on bedding? There was no universal answer, because frontier survival was never a single manual followed by every household. Climate differed. Landscapes differed. Fuel differed. Buildings differed. Families differed. What remained constant was the need to make decisions before scarcity became absolute. And this helps explain why experienced settlers paid such close attention to things modern households barely notice. The direction of the wind, the thickness of cloud, the condition of the stove, the dryness of a haystack, the remaining pile of cobs, the number of pieces of wood beside the wall. These were not background details. They were information, because when the horizon disappeared into blowing snow, the family could no longer depend on what the landscape might provide tomorrow. For a while, their entire winter world became whatever they had remembered to bring inside. What they had brought inside was not always enough. That was when a winter household began making smaller and smaller circles around the heat it still possessed. A family might have started the season using the stove almost casually, breakfast in the morning, supper at night, a warm room throughout the day when work kept people indoors. But as the reserve shrank, every firing acquired a purpose. The stove was no longer simply kept going because a warm house felt pleasant. It was lit because something specific needed to happen. Water had to be heated. Bread had to be baked. A pot of food had to be cooked. Wet mittens had to be dried. Children had to be warmed after coming inside. Once those tasks were finished, the fire could be allowed to fall lower than anyone preferred. This created a rhythm of temperature that modern central heating has largely erased. The interior of a frontier home could move through repeated cycles of warmth and cold during the same day. Morning began with a stove that had cooled overnight. Somebody climbed from beneath blankets into air that might feel painfully cold, stirred whatever embers remained, and rebuilt the fire. The first minutes were often the worst. Metal felt frozen. Water might have a skin of ice. Breath could be visible. Clothing that had been left away from the bed might be cold enough that putting it on felt like another chore. Gradually, the stove changed the room. Not the whole house at once. First, the metal body warmed. Then the air immediately around it. Then, nearby furniture and objects began absorbing heat. Eventually, the main room became tolerable. That slow process taught families to think spatially about warmth. There were good places to sit, bad places to sit, A chair beside an exterior wall could be much colder than one near the stove. A sleeping place beneath a draught or beside a poorly fitted window could feel entirely different from another bed only a few feet away. The household learned its own map of cold. Older houses often revealed themselves through moving air. A gap between logs, a loose door, an opening around a window frame, a poorly sealed roofline, a crack near the floor. Cold air did not need much invitation. So families sealed what they could. Log cabins might be chinked with combinations of clay, mud, grass, stones, or other local material between the logs. Those fillings could crack and require repair. Sod buildings brought different maintenance problems, but their thick walls offered an advantage that became especially noticeable when fuel was scarce. A wall made largely from earth contained a great deal of thermal mass. It did not create heat, but it could moderate rapid temperature changes. Thick sod also resisted the wind far better than a thin, poorly sealed wooden wall. On the Great Plains, where lumber could be costly or difficult to obtain, settlers cut blocks from the prairie itself and stacked them into walls. The resulting house could look humble, even primitive. Yet in one very important respect, the prairie was helping insulate its occupants. Roof construction mattered too. Sod roofs could leak. Dirt could fall into rooms. Insects might appear. Heavy rain could create misery. But a thick roof also placed more material between the family and the winter sky. In fuel terms, every improvement that slowed heat loss effectively stretched the fuel supply. This was why small shelters sometimes had a practical advantage. A large room impressed visitors. A small room was easier to heat. Families living through their first winters often discovered that the grander dimensions imagined before settlement could become liabilities once cold weather arrived. More interior space meant more air to warm and more exterior surface through which heat could escape. Some homes therefore functioned almost like one-room winter camps, even when more space existed. Daily life concentrated around the stove because that was where both heat and work accumulated. Meals happened there. Mending happened there. Reading happened there. Children played there. Tools might be repaired there. Food could be prepared there. Conversation gathered there because there was little reason to sit alone in a colder room. Winter compressed social space. It also changed sleeping. At night, the fire might not be maintained at full strength. For families burning limited wood or fast-burning substitute fuel, attempting to preserve summer-like indoor temperatures until morning could consume an unreasonable amount of the reserve. So the bed became a shelter within the shelter. Mattresses could be filled with straw, corn husks, feathers, or other available materials, depending on the household and its means. Blankets and quilts were layered. Feather ticks, when available, provided substantial insulation. Families could use warming pans or heated objects to take the worst chill from bedding, although such methods required great care around cloth and straw. Bed curtains, where used, could create a smaller pocket of air around sleepers. Sharing beds was common for reasons that went beyond fuel, but in winter the thermal benefit was obvious. Two bodies under the same blankets produced more heat than one. Children might sleep together. Siblings might share. Guests could be fitted into arrangements that modern ideas of privacy would consider crowded. Privacy was easier to value when the temperature allowed it. The important distinction was between warming a room and warming a person. If there was not enough fuel to accomplish both, warming the person was cheaper. Layers of clothing worked according to the same principle. Wool, flannel, knitted items, lined garments, shawls, stockings, caps and mittens trapped air close to the body. Clothing reduced the amount of heat the stove had to supply. Pioneers also understood wind in a direct physical way. Cold was one thing. Cold air moving rapidly through a crack was another. Outside, wind could make fuel gathering dangerous and exhausting. Inside, it could steadily strip warmth from the room. A door opened carelessly during a storm could send a blast across the floor and remind everyone exactly how fragile indoor comfort was. Doors therefore opened for reasons: get the wood, bring in water, check the stock, then shut it. The person coming back inside also carried the outdoors with them. Snow on boots, ice on clothing, frozen hems, wet gloves. Those things needed to thaw somewhere, and thawing consumed heat. This made moisture an enemy almost as persistent as cold. Wet clothes pulled warmth away from the body. Damp bedding became miserable. Wet fuel smoked and resisted ignition. Melting snow near the stove added humidity to the room. Condensation could collect on cold surfaces. A family trying to stay warm was constantly moving water from one state to another. Snow became water. Wet clothing became dry clothing. Frozen food became usable food. Ice in a bucket became liquid. Every transformation required heat. The stove paid for all of them. That was one reason winter chores were often arranged to avoid needless warming and cooling. If someone had to go outside, several tasks could be done during the same trip. Feed animals, bring fuel, check the well, carry something from the shed. Going in and out repeatedly wasted both human warmth and household warmth. Animals introduced another layer of calculation. Livestock generated heat themselves, but they also required enormous attention during storms. Cattle, horses, pigs and chickens could not simply be ignored while the family remained near the stove. Water could freeze, feed had to be supplied, animals could become trapped or injured. A valuable horse represented transportation, farm labour, and financial security. Keeping it alive might be as important to long-term survival as keeping a room comfortable. So someone went outside, sometimes repeatedly. The person returned exhausted, carrying another armful of fuel if any could be found along the way. And the door opened once more. For a few seconds, winter entered the house. Then the door shut. The wind became a muffled sound again, and everyone instinctively moved closer to the stove. This was the quiet logic of fuel scarcity. Survival did not always mean defeating the cold. More often, it meant surrendering most of the house to it. One room remained warmer. One stove remained alive. One bed remained deeply covered. One kettle remained thawed. And beyond that little island, winter was allowed to have almost everything else. The difficulty was that even this small island of warmth consumed more fuel than a family could casually gather after supper. Winter survival usually began months earlier. Long before the first hard freeze, people had to decide what they would burn, where they would find it, how they would move it, and where they would keep it dry. In timber country, this meant cutting wood while roads were passable and while daylight still lasted long enough to make heavy work practical. On the open plains, it could mean collecting several different fuels at once, because no single source was dependable enough to trust for an entire winter. This preparation was not glamorous. A tree had to be turned into stove-sized pieces through a sequence of exhausting tasks. It was felled, trimmed, cut into sections, transported, split, stacked, and left where air could circulate around it. Freshly cut wood contained considerable moisture. Burn it too green and much of the fire's energy was spent driving that moisture away, rather than heating the house. Green wood also tended to smoke and burn poorly. Seasoned wood was better. That meant the household preparing for January often needed to think about January while the weather still felt nothing like winter. The safest woodpile was not the one begun after the snow started. It was the one already drying months before. For settlers without nearby timber, the problem shifted from cutting to transportation. A stand of trees might exist along a river or creek, yet the distance between that timber and the house determined whether it was a practical fuel source. Wood is heavy. A wagon load represented hours of cutting and loading before the team even began pulling it home. Roads could become muddy in spring, deeply rutted in summer, and nearly impassable beneath winter snow. Horses and oxen required feed while performing the work. Equipment wore down, axes dulled, harness broke. Fuel had a hidden cost in calories, animal labour, and time. A household that spent an entire day hauling wood was not spending that day repairing fences, harvesting crops, preserving food, building shelter, or preparing livestock for winter. Nothing was free merely because money had not changed hands. This helps explain the value of fuels that appeared near the farm itself. Corncobs were not beautiful fuel, but they did not require a journey to a distant woodland. Neither did stalks left after harvest. Neither did prairie hay. Neither did dried manure from cattle. The advantage was not simply that these materials burned, it was that they reduced transportation. A weak fuel beside the house could sometimes be more useful than an excellent log several miles away. Hay presented one of the most ingenious adaptations to treeless country. Ordinary loose hay burned so rapidly that feeding it directly into a stove could become almost ridiculous. Flames rose, the material vanished, and someone immediately needed another armful. Settlers therefore developed ways of twisting hay into tighter forms. A handful could be rolled and twisted into something resembling a rope or stick. The compressed material exposed less surface area at once and could be fed through the stove door more steadily. The work was repetitive enough that devices were eventually created to help twist hay. But whether done by hand or with a simple mechanism, the principle remained the same. Change the shape of the fuel and you changed how it burned. This was frontier engineering at its most ordinary. No laboratory, no patent required. Just a person discovering that the stove consumed loose grass faster than the household could comfortably feed it, and then trying to make the grass behave more like wood. Even then, hay demanded attention. A large pile that looked impressive could contain surprisingly little long-lasting heat compared with dense hardwood. The person tending the stove became part of the combustion system. Feed again? A long winter evening might be measured by the repeated opening of an iron door. Corncobs behaved differently. After corn had been shelled, cobs accumulated as a byproduct that had already surrendered their primary food value. Dry cobs could burn hot, and farmers in corn country had them in enormous quantities during good harvest years. They could be stored in cribs, bins, sheds, or piles protected from excessive moisture. A basket of cobs was easy to carry. Children could bring them in. They required no splitting, no axe, no trip to timber. But again, they burned more quickly than substantial logs. So households mixed fuels. A little wood established a strong fire. Cobs increased the heat. Hay kept it going when wood was being conserved. Coal, where affordable and available through transportation networks, could dramatically alter the equation. By the later 19th century, expanding railroads allowed coal to reach communities that could never have supplied themselves locally. Towns connected to rail lines gained access to a dense fuel that did not depend upon nearby forests. But railroad coal was not an answer everywhere. It cost money. It required distribution. A remote homestead could not burn a railroad schedule. Families living beyond convenient markets remained dependent on what the land around them could provide. That local dependence created striking regional differences. In one place, oak might be normal. Elsewhere, cottonwood. Elsewhere, coal. Elsewhere, buffalo chips. Elsewhere, cow chips and hay. Elsewhere, corn waste. And many households used combinations depending on what remained available at a particular moment. This also means that the phrase, the pioneers, can be misleading if it makes millions of people across enormous distances sound as though they all lived the same winter. They did not. A settler in wooded Wisconsin faced a different fuel landscape from a homesteader in Nebraska. A Mormon settlement in Utah confronted different resources from a mining community in Colorado. An Oregon Trail emigrant cooking beside a wagon had different needs from a family occupying a permanent sod house. Even neighbors could live differently if one owned timbered land and the other did not. Access mattered. So did wealth. The prosperous household could sometimes purchase fuel rather than gathering every piece personally. It might own better wagons, stronger teams, more efficient stoves, larger barns for storage, or enough money to buy coal. A poorer family had fewer margins. Scarcity was harsher when there was nothing available to purchase and no money to purchase it with anyway. The stove itself could deepen that inequality. By the 19th century, cast iron stoves offered enormous practical advantages over many traditional open fireplaces. They concentrated heat, allowed greater control of airflow, and could use fuels that would have been awkward in a hearth. But a good stove had to be manufactured, transported, purchased, and maintained. Stovepipe had to be installed. Damaged parts might need replacement. A family beginning with almost nothing could not assume immediate access to the best equipment. Efficiency, therefore, came from both technology and behaviour. Even with a basic stove, users learned its personality. How far to open the draft, how tightly to pack certain fuel, how much ash to leave beneath a fire, when to add another piece, which material started easily, which material lasted, which material produced too much smoke. A stove became familiar in the same way a work animal became familiar. Families noticed its habits because wasting fuel meant repeating physical labour. And by midwinter, every unnecessary trip outside felt more expensive. The most successful households did not necessarily possess endless supplies. They became skilled at matching the fuel to the task. Fast heat for cooking, steadier fuel for nighttime, cheap material during mild weather, better wood saved for brutal cold, scraps for kindling, coals protected whenever possible. Nothing burned without a reason. By late winter, that discipline could become visible in the shrinking pile beside the house. What had looked abundant in October was smaller in December. Smaller again in January. Then February arrived, and the family began measuring the remaining fuel against a question nobody could answer with certainty. How much winter was left? Because surviving when the woodpile was low required more than knowing how to burn unusual things. It required guessing how slowly you could consume the present without leaving yourself helpless against the future. That uncertainty made late winter psychologically different from early winter. In November, a shrinking pile could still look reassuring. There was plenty left. The family had prepared. The barn contained feed. The shelves held preserved food. The stove could be filled without much hesitation. By February, the same household might look at every resource differently. A row of split logs was no longer a woodpile, it was a number of nights. A bin of corncobs was a number of meals. A stack of twisted hay was a number of hours before somebody had to go outside again. The problem was that nobody could convert those materials into an exact calendar. A mild week might stretch the reserve beautifully. One severe cold snap could destroy the calculation. This encouraged habits that looked almost miserly from the outside. A family might burn poor fuel on a tolerable afternoon while leaving good wood untouched. A heavy log that would have made the room comfortable could remain beside the wall because comfort today was being traded for security tomorrow. Children could be told not to add another piece. The stove door stayed shut. People put on another layer. That restraint was not always pleasant, but it reflected an important rule of scarcity. The last piece of fuel was more valuable than the first. When supplies were abundant, one extra log hardly mattered. When only a handful remained, each one became a decision. Whether knowledge therefore carried practical value, settlers watched clouds, wind, temperature, animal behaviour, and changes in the sky because the next storm could affect almost every part of household planning. Their forecasts were not magically accurate. Traditional weather signs could be useful observations, misleading folklore, or mixtures of both. A ring around the moon might precede changing weather under certain atmospheric conditions, but it did not provide a precise schedule. Animal behaviour could reflect environmental change without reliably predicting a blizzard 3 days away. Still, people paid attention. They had little reason not to. If the morning felt unusually still and the sky suggested change, gathering additional fuel before noon was sensible even if no storm arrived. Being unnecessarily prepared cost labour. Being correctly worried could save a life. Official weather information improved gradually as telegraph networks expanded and organised forecasting developed in the 19th century. But a remote farmstead could remain far removed from timely reports. Even where forecasts existed, transportation did not stop being local. Knowing that cold weather was approaching did not cause a wagon of firewood to appear beside the house. The family still needed to act, and action became increasingly difficult when snow accumulated. Deep snow could bury cow chips, fallen branches, and low brush. Drifts blocked roads and made wagon travel impossible. A sled could sometimes move over snow more effectively than a wheeled wagon, but only if animals were available and conditions allowed it. Fuel collection could become a physical contest against the landscape. A person walking through deep snow burned enormous energy simply moving. Hands lost dexterity in extreme cold. Metal tools became painful to touch. An axe used carelessly by an exhausted person could produce an injury more dangerous than the original shortage. This created another calculation. How much fuel should be spent warming the person who goes out to gather more fuel? The question sounds almost circular because it was every major household resource depended on another. People needed food to perform work. Food often needed fire to cook. Fire needed fuel. Fuel needed labor to gather. Labor required clothing, shelter, tools, and sometimes animals. Animals needed feed and water. Water might need heat to thaw. Nothing existed in isolation. A fuel shortage could therefore spread into the rest of the household economy. Suppose the family had enough food stored, but little wood. Beans, grains, and dried foods could remain plentiful while becoming expensive to prepare because some required long cooking. A hard piece of dried meat might need simmering. Frozen food needed thawing. Bread required heat. The family could alter meals to reduce fuel demand. Foods that cooked quickly became attractive. Previously cooked food could be reheated instead of prepared from the beginning. Several dishes could be cooked while the stove was already hot. A large pot might provide more than one meal. The principle was simple. If fire was going to be used, make that fire accomplish as much as possible. Baking could be organised the same way. Instead of heating an oven repeatedly for small amounts, a household might prepare several items while the necessary heat was available. Bread, pies, beans, or other foods could be arranged around the thermal cycle of a stove or oven. Experienced cooks learned to judge heat without modern thermostats. They watched the fire. They knew the behaviour of the stove. They felt heat with practiced caution. They recognized how particular fuels changed cooking conditions. A stove filled with cobs did not behave exactly like one burning dense wood. Fast fuels could produce intense heat quickly and then fade. The cook adjusted. This practical knowledge was rarely written down with the precision of an engineering manual because much of it passed through everyday work. Watch. Try. Burn something. Remember what happened. Do it better next time. The same learning process governed ash. Wood ash accumulated whether a family wanted it or not. It had to be removed so that airflow through the stove was not choked. Yet ash was not always treated simply as waste. Depending on the material burned and local practices, wood ashes could contribute to soap making, cleaning tasks, garden use, or other household processes. Even the remains of fire could enter another chain of usefulness. That pattern was everywhere in pioneer life because hauling manufactured goods over long distances made waste expensive. Clothing was patched. Metal was repaired. Containers were reused. Grease was saved. Bones could become useful material. Cloth scraps became quilts or stuffing, and fuel scraps became smaller fuel scraps until they were finally ash. Scarcity encouraged a kind of material imagination. An object was not finished merely because its original purpose had ended. A barrel could become storage. A broken board could become a shelf. A ruined shelf could become kindling. The final stage was heat. That hierarchy became especially important during emergencies. Yet families also had to recognize when burning an object would cause a larger problem later. Fence rails were tempting fuel, but removing too many could create trouble with livestock. Structural lumber could produce heat, but destroying part of a building to warm another was rarely sensible unless circumstances were desperate. Desperation had degrees. First, burn the ordinary reserve, then the substitute fuel, then the scraps, then objects that could be replaced. Only after that did truly painful choices appear. This is one reason historical accounts of winter hardships sometimes mention people burning things that sound surprising: pieces of fencing, furniture, construction material, or other wooden possessions. Such decisions should not be turned into picturesque frontier eccentricities. If somebody burned part of a useful object, the real story was usually that fuel had become more valuable than the object. Warmth had climbed the household hierarchy. And yet there was another resource that could sometimes prevent families from reaching that stage. Distance between households might be considerable, but winter isolation was rarely complete. When neighbours could still travel, a person running low on fuel could ask for help before the final log disappeared. That timing mattered. Request help too early, and pride might interfere. Request it too late, and the storm might already have closed the road. Frontier independence existed, but so did frontier dependence. A family might have built its own house and planted its own crop, yet still depend on a neighbour's team, another person's saw, a community woodcutting effort, or borrowed fuel after an accident. The strongest survival strategy was often not complete self-sufficiency. It was having enough relationships that one household's shortage did not immediately become one household's disaster. But winter could test even that network. If snow continued falling and the roads stayed closed, every family eventually faced the same question inside its own walls. What can we burn next? And the answer revealed just how many ordinary things had been quietly storing sunlight all along. That stored sunlight was easiest to recognize in wood. A tree had spent years capturing energy through its leaves, building trunks and branches from carbon drawn out of the air. Cut it, dry it, and burn it, and some of that accumulated energy returned as heat. But grass had done the same thing. So had corn. So had every plant a cow or bison had eaten before leaving dried manure behind. The fuels that looked strange to newcomers were not mysterious at all. They were simply different forms of plant material, gathered and concentrated in different ways. Once settlers understood that the prairie stopped looking quite so fuel-poor. It was still difficult country for heating. There was no pretending otherwise. Grass could not match a dense hardwood log for convenience. A pile of buffalo chips was not the same thing as a forest. Corncobs vanished rapidly in a hot stove. Hay demanded continual feeding. Yet a treeless landscape was not an energyless landscape. The challenge was collecting enough of that energy before weather made collection difficult. Consider dried manure. To someone raised in a wooded region, gathering animal dung for a household fire could feel like a humiliating step backward. To someone who had spent months crossing open country, that reaction could disappear quickly. A dry buffalo chip was portable. It was already broken into manageable pieces. It did not require an axe. It did not need splitting. And during the great period of overland migration, bison herds had left enormous quantities across portions of the plains. Travellers gathered them because necessity made the argument better than pride ever could. The cooking fire did not care what respectable fuel was supposed to look like. If a dry chip boiled coffee and cooked supper, it worked. There was also a practical lesson hidden in the smell, one that modern imaginations sometimes exaggerate. Thoroughly dried dung does not burn like fresh manure. Much of what remains is fibrous plant matter. Accounts vary in their enthusiasm, and conditions obviously differed. but experienced travellers could regard good dry chips as perfectly serviceable fuel. The important word was dry. A wet buffalo chip could transform a simple cooking task into a battle of smoke, patience, and reluctant flame. That made children hunting across camp for the driest pieces more than a comic frontier detail. They were doing quality control. Colour, weight, hardness, and condition mattered. People became good at judging fuel because failure had immediate consequences. A piece that looked usable but contained too much moisture might smoke instead of giving clean heat. A loose bundle of grass might disappear before a kettle came to a boil. A log that had not seasoned properly might hiss at the ends as moisture escaped. Fire offered instant criticism. If you selected badly, everyone near the stove knew. This is one reason fuel knowledge became highly local. Families learned which trees in their region burned well. They learned which wood split easily. They discovered what produced useful coals and what vanished quickly. Cottonwood, common along waterways in parts of the plains, provided desperately needed timber and fuel, but it did not possess the heating characteristics of the best dense hardwoods farther east. You burned what existed. That phrase may capture frontier adaptation better than any romantic story about mastering nature. People rarely got to choose the ideal resource. They learned to make local resources work. The same principle governed manure after cattle replaced bison across much of the settled plains. Cow chips became familiar fuel. Families gathered them from pastures and dried them for future use. A good supply could be stacked under cover where rain and snow would not ruin it. There was something almost agricultural about the process. You did not wait until the stove was empty and then walk outside hoping to find supper scattered across the ground. You collected ahead. You dried ahead. You stored ahead. Fuel gathering became another seasonal harvest. Hay was harvested deliberately, of course, mostly because livestock required feed. But when grass was used as heating fuel, another difficult calculation appeared. Every bundle burned in a stove could not be eaten by an animal. This trade-off could become serious during a hard winter. A household did not possess separate universes of resources. The same haystack might represent both animal survival and human warmth. Burn too much, and livestock could suffer. Burn too little, and the family could suffer. The animals themselves represented stored value. A cow might provide milk. A horse might provide transportation and field labour. Oxen could pull loads. Losing an animal during winter meant more than losing one creature. It could damage the farm's ability to plant, travel, haul, and recover when spring arrived. So pioneers did not simply burn anything combustible without thought. They ranked resources according to competing needs. That ranking could change by the hour. During mild weather, hay might remain animal feed. During a brutal cold spell, with no other fuel, some of it might move toward the stove. During true desperation, objects normally protected at all costs could become candidates for burning. Scarcity rearranged value. There was another source of fuel that increasingly changed Western life as settlements grew: commerce. A lone homestead depended heavily on local materials. A town connected to a railroad could draw energy from far beyond its immediate landscape. Coal moved by rail. So did lumber. A community that once faced severe local timber limits might eventually buy fuel brought from hundreds of miles away. This was a profound change. The frontier household had once needed to live within the energy budget of the nearby landscape. Transportation networks stretched that budget outward. A railroad did not create coal. It made distant coal locally usable. The consequences appeared gradually. Settlements near reliable transportation gained fuel choices unavailable to isolated farms. Merchants could stock coal. Lumberyards could sell wood that had grown nowhere near town. Households with money could purchase some of their winter security. But dependence on markets introduced different vulnerabilities. Prices could rise. Deliveries could fail. Rail lines could be blocked by snow. A family might have money and still find the coal bin empty if transportation broke down. The old lesson remained useful. Keep something in reserve. For many households, that reserve stayed remarkably mixed. Coal beside wood, wood beside cobs, cobs beside chips, hay waiting as a last resort. The variety itself was protection. If one fuel ran short, another could carry part of the burden. That kind of redundancy rarely appears in romantic paintings, because paintings prefer a single glowing fireplace. Real survival was messier. A bucket of ashes near the stove, a basket of cobs by the door, wood stacked where it could remain dry, twisted hay shedding bits of grass across the floor, boots thawing, a kettle steaming, children bringing in another load, someone checking the draft, someone wondering whether the remaining wood should be used tonight. Nothing in that room needed to look heroic. It only needed to work. And over time, that constant adaptation changed the meaning of abundance itself. A family surrounded by forest might measure wealth in cords of wood. A family on the plains might feel secure looking at several completely different piles. The question was no longer whether they possessed a large wood pile. The better question was whether they possessed enough burnable energy, in whatever form the land had offered, to outlast the cold. That was the real contest. Not pioneer against wilderness. Not human determination against some dramatic enemy. It was a quieter contest between stored heat and passing time. Every night consumed a little more of the reserve. Every sunrise meant one night had been survived. And somewhere beneath frozen soil, dormant grassroots were waiting for spring. If the family could make its remaining fuel last until the landscape began producing again, the crisis would slowly reverse. Days would lengthen, snow would soften, roads would reopen, fuel gathering would become easier. But until then, the house remained an accounting book written in wood, grass, cobs, and ash. And sometimes, the most important number in that book was not how much fuel remained. It was how little fire a family could learn to live with. Learning to live with less fire did not mean simply accepting discomfort. It meant deciding where heat mattered most. A frontier household facing true fuel scarcity could not afford to treat every hour, every room, and every person exactly the same. Heat had to be directed toward the moments when losing it would create the greatest trouble. Morning was one of those moments. After a weak overnight fire, the house could be at its coldest just before dawn. If the stove had gone completely out, rebuilding it became the first serious task of the day. The person who rose first paid the price. Leaving a warm bed meant stepping into air that might be close to freezing. Clothing could be pulled beneath blankets before getting up, or left near enough to the bed that dressing required as little exposure as possible. Then came the stove. If coals had survived beneath the ash, the morning began well. They could be uncovered gently, given air, and fed with tinder or very small dry material. A few glowing fragments might save the family from starting completely over. If no ember remained, ignition required more effort. Dry tinder mattered. So did kindling. This was one reason tiny pieces of wood could remain valuable even in a household burning mostly hay, chips, or cobs. Fast-burning substitute fuels might produce plenty of heat once a flame existed, yet getting them started reliably was another problem. A shaving of dry wood, a sliver split from a board, a scrap of paper, when paper could be spared, dry grass carefully arranged, small twigs collected earlier. The beginning of a fire required material that caught easily. People therefore protected tinder almost as carefully as larger fuel. Moisture could ruin the whole sequence. A wet morning, a leaking roof, snow tracked indoors, or damp storage could leave the family with plenty of combustible material and very little that wanted to ignite. That was one of the strange realities of winter hardship. You could be surrounded by things that would eventually burn and still struggle to produce a flame. Once the fire caught, the first heat had jobs waiting for it. Water might need thawing. Breakfast needed preparation. Hands needed warming before fine work could begin. Boots, stiffened by cold, had to become wearable. If anyone had been sick during the night, keeping that person warm might move ahead of every other task. Illness changed fuel priorities quickly. A healthy adult could tolerate a colder room by wearing more clothing and staying active. A sick child, an elderly person, or someone recovering from injury could be far more vulnerable. The household might then burn fuel it had hoped to save. This was another reason the winter reserve could not be planned with mathematical precision. Firewood did not disappear only according to temperature. Human events consumed it too. A birth, an illness, wet clothing after an accident, a visitor trapped by weather, livestock needing emergency care. Each could increase demand unexpectedly, and even ordinary bodies needed different amounts of protection. Babies could not simply put on another coat and fetch wood. Small children might become cold without recognizing the danger quickly. Older adults could have less tolerance for prolonged exposure. Keeping the most vulnerable people close to the stove was therefore a practical arrangement, not merely an affectionate one. The warmest chair might not belong to whoever wanted it. Space near the fire had value. So did the top of the stove. A cast iron surface could become a small landscape of thermal opportunity. A kettle remained warm near one area. A pot simmered in another. Something damp might be positioned nearby to dry. Food could be kept from freezing. A brick or flat stone, heated carefully, might later carry warmth elsewhere, though any heated object needed handling with care to avoid burns or fire. Heat was moved indirectly because the stove itself could not follow people into bed. The household learned to borrow warmth while it was available. Even meals helped. Hot food did not replace environmental heat, but a warm stew or drink could make a cold evening more tolerable. A pot simmering on a stove also made use of heat already being produced for the room. This encouraged meals that combined efficiency with practicality. Soups and stews could incorporate small portions of meat, grains, vegetables, and leftovers into one vessel. A single fire handled several ingredients at once. But long cooking still cost fuel, so preparation mattered. Beans could be soaked before cooking. Food could be cut smaller. Covered pots retained heat better than uncovered ones. Once boiling, a dish might not need the strongest possible flame. These were small economies. Winter survival was full of small economies. Closing a door, putting a lid on a pot, saving an ember, drying tomorrow's kindling today, doing 2 outdoor chores in one trip, sleeping closer together, choosing the faster meal, burning cobs during the afternoon and saving wood for night. No single act rescued the household. Together, they reduced the speed at which the reserve disappeared. The same conservation extended to lighting. Winter nights were long, and artificial light itself required resources. Candles consumed tallow or wax. Oil lamps required oil. A household already rationing fuel might also avoid unnecessary consumption of lighting materials. Daily schedules could therefore follow daylight more closely. Work needing good visibility was done while the sun remained. Evenings invited tasks that could be performed near the stove under limited light: mending, shelling, quiet handwork, conversation, reading where conditions allowed. Then bed became attractive partly because staying awake cost resources. A person under blankets required very little household fuel compared with someone sitting in a room expecting the stove to maintain comfort. Going to bed early was an energy strategy, whether anyone described it that way or not. The fire could fall, the lamp could go dark, bodies could retreat into insulation. Outside, the house might become colder hour by hour. Inside, the bed warmth was trapped on a much smaller scale. This reveals something easy to miss when we imagine pioneers simply enduring winter. They were constantly changing the scale of the environment they attempted to control. If there was abundant fuel, heat the room. If there was less, heat one part of the room. If there was very little, heat the body. If the fire could not be maintained, protect the heat the body already produced. Blankets became walls. Clothing became insulation. Beds became tiny rooms. Human metabolism became the final furnace. Food supplied that furnace, which meant calories themselves mattered during cold weather. Heavy physical labour increased the need for food. Walking through snow, chopping wood, carrying water, tending animals, and maintaining body temperature all demanded energy. A household short of both food and fuel, therefore, faced a much harsher problem than one short of fuel alone. People could compensate for a colder room with clothing and activity only if they had enough nutrition to sustain themselves. This interconnectedness explains why a successful winter reserve included far more than a woodpile. Food, animal feed, dry clothing, bedding, matches or other ignition methods, tools, fuel, shelter, each supported the others. Even an axe was part of the heating system. Break its handle during severe cold, and a supply of standing timber became harder to use. Lose a horse and hauling distant wood became more difficult. Allow boots to remain wet, and the person gathering fuel might become unable to work. Neglect the roof, and stored fuel could become damp. Winter punished weak links. That was why maintenance during warmer seasons mattered so much. Repairing a chimney in autumn, mending clothing before snowfall, sharpening tools, protecting hay from rain, stacking wood properly, and checking a stove might not feel like survival at the time. Months later, each decision returned as an advantage, or its absence returned as a problem. Still, even preparation had limits. There were winters severe enough to overwhelm careful households. Cold could persist. Storms could arrive one after another. Fuel could disappear faster than expected. Then conservation moved beyond inconvenience and into genuine hardship. The stove might remain cold for longer stretches. Cooking could be reduced. The family might spend much of the day wearing nearly everything warm they owned. Frost could remain inside parts of the house. The remaining good fuel could be held back for nights when temperatures dropped furthest. At that stage, people were no longer asking how to make the house comfortable. They were asking how to prevent discomfort from becoming injury. And that boundary was thinner than the frontier legend often admits. The people who survived were not immune to cold. They shivered. Their fingers hurt. They lost sleep. They argued over resources. They made mistakes. They sometimes became sick. Some did not survive. There was no special pioneer body that turned freezing weather into a minor inconvenience. There was only adaptation, preparation, cooperation, and a willingness to accept levels of discomfort that later generations would rarely consider normal. And beneath all those strategies was one quiet rule. Never spend heat merely because you have it. Because until spring truly arrived, every flame carried a little piece of the future with it. That future could sometimes be protected by something as simple as knowing when not to light the stove. A clear winter afternoon offered a small opportunity. Sunlight coming through a window did not heat a frontier house dramatically, but every little contribution mattered when fuel was scarce. A south-facing room could become noticeably less severe while the sun remained high. People could move their work toward that light, postpone unnecessary firing, and allow the building to absorb whatever warmth the day provided for free. Then the sun dropped. The advantage disappeared almost immediately. Windows that admitted light during the day became weak points after dark. Early frontier windows were often small, partly because glass was expensive and difficult to transport, but their size also affected heat loss. A poorly fitted window allowed cold air through gaps around the frame, while the glass itself offered far less insulation than a thick wall. Families responded with whatever was available. Curtains helped. Shutters helped where houses had them. Fabric could be hung across particularly troublesome openings. Cracks could be stuffed temporarily. A rolled blanket placed near the bottom of a door could slow a draft creeping across the floor. These solutions were humble, but a draft was really a fuel leak. Warm air escaping had already been paid for. Somebody had cut, gathered, hauled, twisted, carried, or purchased the material that created that warmth. Letting it disappear through an unnecessary gap meant performing part of that labour for nothing. The same logic applied to chimneys. A fireplace required a strong upward draft to remove smoke, but that draft also carried heated air out of the house. Traditional open fireplaces could therefore consume enormous amounts of wood while delivering surprisingly uneven warmth. Stand directly in front of one, and the radiant heat could feel wonderful. Move across the room and the experience changed. Meanwhile, air needed for combustion entered the building from somewhere, often as cold replacement air through doors, windows, or wall gaps. Cast iron stoves changed this balance. Because the fire was enclosed, airflow could be regulated more carefully. The metal surface radiated heat into the room, and the stove could extract useful warmth from smaller quantities of fuel than an open hearth under many conditions. This helped explain why stoves became so important in 19th century households. A stove did not eliminate the fuel problem. It made the fuel easier to manage. The difference became especially valuable with unconventional materials. Loose grass would have been difficult to control in an open fireplace. Inside an iron stove, it could be confined. Corncobs could be fed into a contained fire without sparks rolling across the floor. Dried manure could be burned for cooking with more control than a completely open flame allowed. The stove turned many awkward fuels into practical household fuels. But stoves also introduced habits of their own. Draft controls mattered. Open them too far and fuel might burn faster than necessary. Restrict the airflow too much and combustion could become smoky or inefficient. The exact behaviour depended on the stove, chimney, fuel, and weather. Families learned through repetition. Strong wind outside could alter draft. A cold chimney behaved differently when first being warmed. Ash build-up changed airflow beneath the fire. Even the arrangement of fuel inside the stove mattered. Dense pieces packed together behaved differently from loose material surrounded by air. Someone tending the stove day after day developed a kind of practical intimacy with it. A glance at the flame could reveal whether more air was needed. A particular sound might signal a strong draft. The warmth of the stovepipe could suggest how hard the fire was running. None of this required scientific vocabulary. It required attention. That attention became more valuable as the fuel supply fell. A careless fire might burn through tomorrow morning's reserve during one unnecessarily warm evening. So the household reduced waste wherever possible. Cooking vessels were covered. Doors were closed quickly. Fuel was sized appropriately. A large piece of precious wood was not necessarily used when a handful of cobs would accomplish the same short task. Kindling was prepared before the fire was allowed to die completely. Ash was managed so that the stove could breathe. Dry fuel remained dry. This last task sounds obvious until winter weather is considered. Stored wood needed protection from rain and snow while still receiving enough air to remain seasoned. Stack it carelessly against damp soil and moisture could creep upward. Cover it too tightly when still green and drying slowed. Leave it exposed and every storm created another problem. A good stack was therefore a small piece of engineering. Wood was raised away from wet ground when possible. Pieces were arranged to permit airflow. A roof, shed, or carefully placed covering protected the upper surface. The household wanted dryness without trapping moisture. Substitute fuels required their own storage methods. Cow chips could be gathered into protected piles or sheds. Corncobs needed ventilation because damp agricultural material could mould. Hay had to be protected from weather, but stored hay also carried a serious fire risk. A spark reaching a dry haystack could erase months of fuel and animal feed in minutes. So convenience fought safety. Store fuel close to the house and winter trips became shorter. Store highly combustible material too close and a household fire became more dangerous. These decisions had no perfect answer. They were compromises. The same compromise appeared in bringing fuel indoors. Keeping a day supply near the stove reduced door openings and avoided repeated trips into severe weather. But piling large amounts of dry combustible material beside a hot iron stove was asking for trouble. A practical household brought enough inside to be useful without surrounding the fire with everything that could feed it. Children had to learn these boundaries. Do not drop hay against the stove. Do not leave a door hanging open. Do not play with the fire. Do not waste the kindling. Do not throw something into the flames simply to watch it burn. Modern childhood can make a fire seem entertaining precisely because household survival no longer depends on preserving every piece of fuel. For a child on a fuel-poor homestead, unnecessary burning could receive a very different reaction. That stick had a purpose. That scrap had been saved. That handful of cobs represented work. The household economy made even small objects visible. There was also the matter of fire starting itself. Matches became increasingly common during the 19th century, but availability and cost varied by time and place. They were not something to squander thoughtlessly. Earlier methods of producing flame required even more care and patience. This made the continued existence of fire valuable. A stove that retained coals overnight contained tomorrow morning's beginning. Before bed, the fire could be arranged with that possibility in mind. A durable piece of fuel might be added. Coals could be banked with ash to slow their consumption. Airflow could be reduced carefully. Then the household went to sleep, knowing that somewhere beneath the grey ash there might still be a small orange point waiting for dawn. Morning revealed whether the effort had worked. If it had, a gentle breath of air could turn that point brighter. Dry tinder followed, then a thin shaving, then a small piece of fuel. The flame returned gradually. This daily resurrection of fire linked one day to the next. The family did not necessarily experience winter as a sequence of completely separate fires. It could be one fire carefully carried across weeks, repeatedly reduced to embers and rebuilt. That continuity gave the hearth or stove a meaning beyond simple machinery. It was where meals began, where frozen hands returned, where damp clothes dried, where children gathered, where the household measured the severity of the night. But scarcity also stripped away sentimentality. A fire was beautiful only after it was useful. Its first obligation was work. And no matter how comforting the glow appeared, an experienced family knew that the flames visible tonight were consuming material that might be desperately needed 3 mornings later. So they watched the fire without merely admiring it. They listened to it, adjusted it, fed it reluctantly when necessary, allowed it to fade when possible, and before going to bed, they covered its last coals with ash, hoping to preserve just enough heat to begin again. Outside, the winter darkness could stretch for hours. Inside, almost everything went cold. Yet beneath that quiet layer of ash, a few surviving embers could remain. Not enough to warm the house, not enough to cook, barely enough to see. But sometimes, enough was all a family needed. Enough could also mean knowing when to stop trying to make one fuel behave like another. If the remaining wood had become too precious to burn freely, a family might reorganize the entire day around whatever substitute was most abundant. The stove would behave differently, meals would change, chores would shift, and somebody might spend far more time feeding the fire, but the household could continue. That flexibility separated inconvenience from crisis. Hay provides one of the clearest examples. A log could be placed into a stove and left alone for a while. Hay demanded attention. Even when twisted tightly, it burned more rapidly than substantial wood. A person might sit near the stove with a supply beside them, feeding the fire again and again. This made heating oddly labour-intensive. To stay warm, someone had to remain available to produce warmth. The fire tender could not simply disappear for hours to perform another distant chore unless enough slower-burning fuel had been added first. the household schedule bent around combustion. Imagine an evening built around that small, repetitive movement. Take a twist of hay, open the stove, push it in, close the door, return to sewing, mending, reading, or conversation. Wait. Then do it again. After a while, the action almost disappeared into the rhythm of the room. Children could help prepare the twists. Adults could make them while sitting indoors. Fuel production and fuel consumption occurred almost side by side. The floor might collect loose pieces of grass. Dust and fragments followed the bundles inside. The neat, polished hearth of later nostalgia becomes harder to maintain when the household is effectively feeding portions of the prairie through an iron box all evening. Cow chips created their own domestic landscape. A storage pile could look unimpressive compared with split logs, yet a family familiar with them could judge the reserve practically. Large, dry pieces were useful. Small fragments could assist with starting or filling gaps. Material had to be handled without exposing it unnecessarily to snow or rain. People who depended on such fuels ceased thinking of them as curiosities. They were simply supplies. This matters because many later descriptions of pioneer life turn unusual fuel into comedy. There is certainly humour in the image of emigrants gathering buffalo dung across the plains, and the emigrants themselves sometimes joked about it. But the joke can obscure the competence involved. People learned where to look, what to gather, how much was required, how to protect it, how it burned, how quickly it disappeared, how to combine it with other materials. That is not desperation alone. It is environmental knowledge. The same principle appeared in regions where people burned corn. Corn was more than one thing. The kernels were food and feed. The stalks were agricultural residue with several possible uses. The cobs remained after shelling and could become fuel. Even husks could be useful for stuffing, crafts, bedding-related purposes, or other household tasks, depending on local practice. A successful farm extracted several functions from the same crop. This reduced dependence on resources that had to be purchased or hauled from far away. But there was always competition between uses. Corncobs burned in the stove could no longer serve any other purpose. Stalks burned for heat could not be left in exactly the same way for soil protection or livestock-related uses. Manure burned as fuel was manure not returned directly to fields. Every decision moved material from one part of the farm system to another. Pioneer survival was therefore less about using free resources than about choosing where each resource produced the most value. During a cold emergency, heat climbed rapidly in value. This could create choices that looked irrational during summer. A wooden rail might take real labour to replace in spring, but if burning it kept the household safe through a dangerous night, the future repair became acceptable. A piece of lumber stored for a building project could wait. The cold could not. In severe shortages, families could dismantle parts of what they had built or saved, though such measures were naturally a last resort rather than normal winter practice. A homestead contained many forms of stored labour. Boards represented sawing and transportation. Furniture represented craftsmanship and money. Fence rails represented hours of cutting and construction. Burning one of these things converted stored labour into immediate heat. Once burned, the labour was gone. That is why the decision mattered. You were not merely destroying an object. You were consuming work already completed because the present emergency had become more important than the future benefit. Fuel scarcity could even influence which repairs were attempted during winter. Suppose a shed wall needed a new board. Using good lumber for the repair might protect valuable feed or equipment, but keeping that same board in reserve might provide emergency fuel later. There was no universal correct choice. Families operated under uncertainty. That uncertainty encouraged saving small scraps. Short pieces from construction were stacked instead of discarded. Wooden packing material could be preserved. Branches too small for major use still became kindling, A damaged tool handle might be shortened and reused before eventually reaching the stove. Even bark could have value. Nothing combustible looked entirely worthless in February. The household also watched how rapidly each material produced ash. Ash occupied space beneath the fire and altered airflow. Frequent burning of certain fuels meant more frequent cleaning. Removing hot ash carelessly introduced another fire risk, because embers could remain alive long after they appeared harmless. Ashes needed a safe destination. Dumping them beside combustible material was dangerous. Placing them in wooden containers could be dangerous if hidden coals survived. A tiny ember buried inside grey powder could persist quietly and ignite something later. So even waste from the stove demanded judgment. The safest households developed routines because routines prevented mistakes when people were tired. Fuel here, ashes there, matches or ignition tools in a known place, kindling kept dry, stove door shut. Children taught the rules. The ordinary repetition protected people. Fatigue was a real threat during severe winters. Someone waking repeatedly to tend a fast-burning fire could become careless. Outdoor chores remained necessary. Sleep might be interrupted by animals, weather, illness, or the simple realization that the room had become too cold. Exhaustion made every task harder. An axe was more dangerous. A lantern was easier to knock over. A stove door could be left open. Wet clothing could be neglected. One more trip for fuel could feel unbearable. This is where cooperation inside the family mattered as much as cooperation between neighbours. Work could be divided. One person gathered. Another prepared meals. Someone watched young children. Someone tended livestock. Someone kept the stove supplied. Roles were shaped by age, gender expectations, physical ability, circumstance and household custom, but necessity could override neat categories. If the usual fuel gatherer became sick, somebody else had to learn the task. If an adult was injured, older children might take on more work. If a storm trapped one person away from home, those remaining could not postpone survival until that person returned. Knowledge distributed across the household made it more resilient. Everyone did not need equal skill at every job, but too much dependence on one person created vulnerability. A fire was a particularly unforgiving teacher of this lesson. If only one person knew how to manage the stove properly, illness could turn ordinary heating into a problem. Children learned by watching. How much tinder? How the draft moved? What dry fuel looked like? When the coals needed attention? Which pieces should be saved? These were small lessons, absorbed through repetition rather than formal instruction. And eventually, a child old enough to remember being warned away from the stove became old enough to tend it. The household gained another pair of capable hands. That gradual transfer of knowledge was one of the hidden reasons families could adapt to places their first season had made seem impossible. The land itself did not become easier. The winter did not become warmer. What changed was the number of mistakes required to get through it. After several years, people knew which fuel to store, how early to gather it, where snow drifted around the buildings, which wall leaked wind, how long a basket of cobs lasted, how much hay the stove consumed on a cold evening, which neighbour could help with hauling, where deadwood collected after spring floods. Experience converted uncertainty into estimates. Not perfect estimates, but better ones. And when the woodpile again looked frighteningly small, an experienced family could look beyond it. They had learned that survival was not contained in that pile alone. It was stored in habits, in tools, in remembered weather, in protected scraps, in neighbours, in children who now knew how to keep a fire alive, and in the quiet understanding that scarcity became less dangerous once everyone in the house knew what to do next. Knowing what to do next became especially important when the shortage was no longer theoretical. There was a moment in some winters when a household stopped saying the fuel was getting low and admitted that it was low. The distinction mattered. Before that moment, conservation was precaution. After it, every decision carried weight. Someone might count the remaining logs, not because counting created more fuel, but because uncertainty itself was dangerous. A pile that looked adequate from across the room could disappear surprisingly quickly once several cold nights were considered. The family needed to know what remained. Good wood, poor wood, kindling, cobs, hay, chips, scraps, anything else that could safely be burned. Then those supplies could be mentally divided according to purpose. Perhaps the best logs were reserved for overnight fires. Perhaps lesser fuel-handled cooking. Perhaps the stove would remain nearly cold through part of the afternoon, when everyone could stay active or sit in sunlight. Perhaps one room would be abandoned completely until warmer weather. Scarcity became easier to manage once it had categories. There was comfort fuel, cooking fuel, starting fuel, emergency fuel, and there was material nobody wanted to burn unless the alternative became worse. That last category could remain untouched for days. A board, a damaged chair, a piece of fencing, a stored length of lumber. Keeping such an object intact preserved the feeling that conditions had not yet become desperate. Burning it crossed a line. But households could not afford to let pride decide when that line should be crossed. If the temperature fell sharply and the ordinary reserve was gone, an object made of dry wood contained heat regardless of what purpose a carpenter had originally given it. The stove reduced distinctions. A beautifully worked piece and an ugly scrap eventually became flame, coals, and ash. Still, destroying useful property could solve one problem while creating another. Burn part of a fence and livestock might wander once spring arrived. Burn construction lumber and repairs would be delayed. Burn furniture and the household became poorer in a very literal sense. This was why true emergency fuel tended to be chosen carefully. People looked first for things already broken. A chair beyond repair, a cracked box, a damaged handle, short building scraps, pieces with little remaining value. Nothing about this required romantic desperation. It was simply another form of household accounting. Use the material with the lowest future value first. Save whatever will be hardest to replace. That principle sounds almost modern because it is. Scarcity has always encouraged prioritization. Yet the frontier version carried a physical immediacy that spreadsheets do not. The calculation took place while fingers were cold. Sometimes, while wind pressed snow against the wall. Sometimes while a child slept nearby. Sometimes while the person making the decision knew another storm might arrive before more fuel could be obtained. Under those conditions, even familiar objects looked different. A wooden box was not only a box. It contained a certain quantity of potential heat. A pile of corn waste was not agricultural clutter. It was several firings of the stove. A sack of dry chips was not refuse. It was breakfast tomorrow. This ability to see hidden usefulness everywhere was one of the most practical frontier skills, but it had limits. Not everything that burned belonged inside a stove. Some materials could create dangerous smoke or sparks. Painted, chemically treated, or manufactured materials became more relevant in later periods. But even an earlier household needed judgment about what could safely enter a fire. Certain woods sparked more than others. Resinous material could burn fiercely. Damp matter produced smoke. Improvised fuels could clog or dirty a stove and chimney. The desperate rule was never simply burn anything. The better rule was use what can be burned safely enough to solve the immediate problem without producing a worse one. Fire remained an indoor hazard even when the family desperately needed it. Perhaps especially then. A cold household was more likely to bring additional combustible material close to the stove. More clothing hung nearby to dry. More fuel waited within easy reach. People crowded closer. Someone tired from gathering wood might fall asleep beside the heat. A child might try to help. A stove operating harder than usual could make nearby surfaces hotter than expected. Scarcity encouraged behaviours that increased fire risk. So discipline mattered most precisely when circumstances made discipline hardest. The chimney had to remain clear. The stove door had to close properly. Hot ash still needed safe handling. Flammable material still needed distance. A family could not afford to save itself from freezing by burning down its shelter. Smoke created another danger that was less visually dramatic. Poor draught could send combustion gases into the room. Houses were often leaky enough that completely airtight conditions were unusual, but that did not make smoke harmless. A smoky stove irritated eyes and lungs. A blocked chimney demanded attention. Strong winds could cause strange draft behaviour. Snow around rooflines or damage to a flue could create additional problems. The heating system was never just the fire. It included the chimney, the stove, the building, the airflow, and the person operating all of them. Keeping each part functioning was easier before the emergency. Once heavy snow arrived, repairing a chimney or replacing damaged stovepipe became far more unpleasant. This brought the household back to an old frontier truth. Summer work survived inside winter. The roof repaired in August was protecting heat in January. The hay stored dry in September was burning cleanly in February. The wood cut early was now seasoned. The extra tool handle made months before became useful when the old one cracked. Preparation was really labour moved through time. You worked when conditions were favourable so that future versions of yourself could work less when conditions became dangerous. Yet no family predicted everything. A winter could simply exceed expectations. When that happened, the social world around the homestead became more important. A neighbour might arrive with wood. A relative might offer temporary shelter. A community could organise cutting or hauling for a household affected by illness or death. Church groups, local associations, and informal neighbour networks could help vulnerable families depending on place and period. These systems were imperfect, but they complicated the myth of total frontier self-reliance. The isolated homesteader has become one of the strongest images of Western settlement. The reality was often more social. Barns were raised collectively. Harvests could involve shared labour. Families exchanged food. People watched one another's children. They lent equipment. And during winter emergencies, they sometimes shared fuel. That did not mean every neighbour was generous or every community harmonious. Disputes over land, livestock, water, fences, debts, politics, ethnicity, religion, and personal grievances could divide settlements. Human beings did not become kinder merely because the nearest town was far away. But harsh environments created practical reasons to maintain relationships, even with people one did not particularly enjoy. The neighbour you argued with in July might own the only team capable of reaching timber in January. Cooperation could be emotional. It could also be extremely practical. Fuel itself sometimes became a form of exchange. A person with timber might trade wood for labour. A household with a wagon could haul for someone without one. Neighbours might cut together, splitting the work according to ability and equipment. Such arrangements turned individual scarcity into a shared logistical problem. And logistics often mattered more than courage. A family could possess the determination to survive and still need a functioning sled. It could possess an axe and still lack a healthy horse. It could possess timber and still lack enough hands to cut it quickly. One household's surplus capacity could fill another household's weakness. This was resilience at the community level. But there were storms when even community networks temporarily disappeared. Snow erased the road between houses. Wind removed landmarks. Travel became too dangerous. No neighbour could reasonably come. No wagon could move. No load of coal could arrive. Then the family returned to the inventory inside its own walls. The stove, the bedding, the food, the remaining fuel, the skills learned over previous winters, and perhaps, somewhere in a corner, one final stack of wood that had been deliberately left untouched. Emergency fuel, the pieces everyone had been told not to use, the reserve kept for the night when the ordinary rules no longer worked. Saving that last supply required discipline. Using it required judgment. Because there was no prize for finishing winter with a perfect stack of emergency wood or someone had suffered unnecessarily from cold, the purpose of the reserve was eventually to be burned. The only question was when. And on the hardest frontier nights, survival often depended on recognizing that moment before caution turned into danger. Recognizing that moment required more than looking at a thermometer. The family had to look at people. If someone was shivering uncontrollably, becoming clumsy, unusually quiet, confused, or simply unable to warm themselves despite layers of clothing, conserving another log could become false economy. Historical households did not possess modern medical language for every stage of cold injury, but they understood from experience that prolonged cold could move from misery into danger. Children were watched. Older people were watched. Anyone returning from outside soaked, exhausted, or numb deserved attention. The fire reserve existed for exactly these moments. A good piece of wood might go into the stove, then another. The draft could be opened enough to wake the fire quickly. The purpose was no longer to stretch fuel elegantly across an uncertain future. The immediate need had become more important than preserving tomorrow's comfort. There was an important distinction between warming a house and rewarming a person. A dangerously cold person could not necessarily be helped simply by placing them as close as possible to a roaring stove. Too much direct heat could burn numb skin before the person realized what was happening. Gentler warming, dry clothing, blankets, warm surroundings, and appropriate care were safer principles, even though specific historical practices varied widely and were not always medically sound. What frontier families did know was that wetness had to be dealt with. The person returning from a snowstorm could carry several pounds of melting trouble into the room. Outer layers were removed. Boots came off. Socks might need changing. Dry clothing replaced damp clothing, if dry clothing existed. Blankets followed. The wet garments then created another fuel expense because they had to dry. A mitten stiff with ice was not ready for tomorrow merely because its owner had reached home. So items were arranged around the stove, carefully. Too far away and they remained wet. Too close and wool could scorch. Leather could dry badly, and cloth could ignite. Boots presented their own problem. Leather benefited from gradual drying more than brutal heat. Put wet leather too near a stove and it could harden, crack, or shrink. Yet frozen boots in the morning could make outdoor work miserable. Winter household knowledge therefore included a surprising amount of material science learned without calling it that. People knew what happened to wool, leather, iron, wood, clay, food, water. Each behaved differently near heat. Even the house itself changed with temperature. Wooden doors swelled or shrank with moisture. Metal contracted in cold. Chimneys responded to repeated heating and cooling. Sod walls could shed dirt as conditions changed. Frost appeared where warm indoor air met sufficiently cold surfaces. The frontier home was not a static box resisting winter. It was always reacting to winter. That movement created maintenance. Cracks opened. Drafts appeared. Snow accumulated where it had not accumulated before. A stovepipe joint loosened. A door stopped fitting properly. Repairs that seemed minor in summer could become fuel problems in January. A gap around a door did not merely let cold air inside. It forced the stove to burn more material to replace lost heat. So a person might spend an hour repairing a draft in order to save many hours of fuel gathering later. Old cloth could be pressed into openings. Mud or clay could repair chinking when conditions permitted. Boards might be adjusted. A temporary barrier could be built inside an entry. Anything that slowed the movement of cold air had potential value. Some households benefited from architectural features that naturally created buffers against winter. An attached shed, porch, entry space, or enclosed passage meant the main living room did not always open directly into the outdoors. The first door admitted cold into one smaller space. The second controlled its movement farther inside. Where no such space existed, opening the main door during severe weather could be dramatic. Cold air, being denser than warm air, rushed low across the floor. Anyone sitting nearby felt it first. Children learned not to linger in doorways. Adults could sound equally impatient. Get in, get out, close it. The command had little to do with manners. The family had spent fuel heating that room. Winter was trying to steal it. Floors were another source of discomfort. A cabin built above bare ground, or with poorly sealed boards, could allow cold air through cracks. Rugs, woven coverings, animal hides where available, or even improvised layers helped reduce the sensation of cold underfoot. Feet mattered disproportionately to comfort. The person with a warm torso and painfully cold feet still felt cold. Thick stockings and proper footwear helped, but footwear itself was difficult to keep dry when snow repeatedly melted on it. The area near the stove therefore became crowded with the day's moisture. Coats, socks, mittens, boots, perhaps a scarf or shawl. Steam rose from some things. Others simply became less rigid. The household smelled of fuel, cooked food, damp wool, leather, smoke, and human occupation. It was not the clean, pine-scented cabin of romantic illustration. Winter survival had odours. Buffalo chips had odours. Cow chips had odours. Wet clothing had odours. Cooking had odours. An iron stove overheated, with dust on its surface, produced its own smell. People lived inside this mixture for months. Ventilation could improve air quality, but ventilation also surrendered heat. Once again, no choice existed in isolation. A completely sealed room was not desirable around combustion. A constantly open window was impossible during severe cold. The household balanced air and warmth through experience. Imperfections in the building, chimney draught, and occasional deliberate airing. The fire itself could reveal trouble. If smoke entered the room, something was wrong. Perhaps the draught was weak. Perhaps fuel was damp. Perhaps the flue was obstructed. Perhaps wind was affecting the chimney. Whatever the cause, ignoring it was not a sustainable heating strategy. So someone investigated. This could mean going outside in exactly the weather everyone wanted to avoid. Climb where necessary. Check the chimney. Clear snow. Inspect a cap or opening. Pray something, with numb hands. The stove that protected the family could demand work at the worst possible time. Fuel scarcity made maintaining it even more important, because poor combustion wasted what remained. An inefficient smoky fire extracted less useful heat from precious material. Good draft, dry fuel, and a functioning stove turned limited fuel into the maximum practical benefit. Yet even an efficient system could not defeat an extreme winter indefinitely. At some point, the family needed weather to change. That dependence shaped the emotional rhythm of late winter. People watched the daylight, not because one sunny afternoon meant spring had arrived, but because days were slowly becoming longer. They noticed snow settling, icicles dripping during warmer hours, dark patches appearing on roads, animals becoming more active, a south-facing slope exposing grass. Small changes could carry enormous meaning. Every degree of natural warming reduced the stove's burden. Every hour above freezing helped open roads. Every exposed patch of ground made gathering certain materials easier. A winter did not end in one clean moment. It weakened. The stove remained necessary, but perhaps not all day. Then, one afternoon, the fire was allowed to go out. Not because fuel had disappeared, because it was no longer needed. That could be a remarkably quiet victory. No announcement. No ceremony. The stove simply became cold while sunlight remained in the room. Perhaps someone noticed and chose not to relight it. The family still expected cold nights. Spring on the plains could reverse itself quickly. A late storm could return. So the surviving fuel was not discarded or forgotten. It remained stacked, protected, ready. Experience discouraged celebrating too early. But the relationship with the woodpile had changed. For months, each piece had represented a shrinking future. Now the remaining pieces represented surplus carried out of danger. The family had made it, not through one ingenious trick, not because cow chips alone saved them, not because sod walls alone saved them, not because pioneers possessed extraordinary immunity to cold. They had made thousands of small decisions. Gather before the storm. Keep it dry. Save the good wood. Use the cobs. Twist the hay. Close the door. Protect the coals. Wear another layer. Cook while the stove is hot. Help the neighbour. Accept help when necessary. Burn the emergency reserve when the emergency finally arrives. And when warmth began returning to the land, another lesson immediately followed. The next winter's fuel problem had already begun. The next winter began with memory. A family that had spent February counting its last pieces of wood did not enter spring with the same assumptions it had carried the year before. Scarcity left instructions behind. Perhaps the woodpile had been too small. Then more wood would be cut. Perhaps too much of it had been green. Then cutting would begin earlier, so the wood had more time to season. Perhaps snow had buried the cow chips. Then more would be gathered and stored under cover. Perhaps loose hay had burned so quickly that someone spent half the night feeding the stove. Then the household might twist more of it ahead of time, improve the twisting method, or search for a better mixture of fuels. Perhaps the front door leaked. Pay it before autumn. Perhaps the stovepipe failed. Replace it. Perhaps a child outgrew a winter coat. Make, alter, trade for, or purchase another before the first serious cold. Experience transformed winter preparation from a vague duty into a list of remembered problems. That list could become surprisingly specific. Where should the wood be stacked so drifting snow would not bury the path to it? How close could fuel remain to the house without creating unnecessary fire risk? Which shed stayed driest? Which part of the creek offered usable deadwood? Which neighbour owned a saw? How long did a wagon trip to timber actually take? How much feed could be spared before burning hay endangered livestock? The answers belonged to one household and one landscape. They were not universal frontier wisdom. They were local knowledge accumulated through mistakes. That distinction matters because pioneers did not arrive on empty land with perfectly formed survival skills. Many settlers were learning environments that were new to them. Some came from wooded regions where fuel had behaved differently as a household resource. Others came from cities, farms, or countries with different climates and building traditions. They adapted unevenly. Some learned quickly. Some received advice from neighbours. Some borrowed practices already developed by indigenous peoples who had lived in those environments for generations. The use of dried bison dung as fuel is one obvious example. It was not an invention suddenly produced by emigrant ingenuity. Indigenous communities of the plains had long understood the value of available fuels in treeless environments. Newcomers adopted techniques because the landscape made their usefulness impossible to ignore. That broader point often disappears from pioneer mythology. Settlers did not conquer an unknown environment through individual cleverness alone. They entered landscapes already known intimately by other people. Indigenous knowledge of plants, animals, water, weather, travel, shelter, and fuel had developed over much longer periods. Contact between peoples could involve trade and exchange, but it also unfolded within the violent processes of dispossession, warfare, forced removal, treaty violation, and expanding settlement. A truthful story of frontier adaptation has to hold both realities at once. A family gathering buffalo chips might simply be trying to cook supper. At the same time, the expanding settler world around that family was helping transform the plains permanently. The bison themselves reveal the scale of that transformation. For overland travelers in earlier decades, vast herds could make dried buffalo dung abundant along some routes. By the late 19th century, commercial hunting, expanding railroads, military policy, settlement, habitat changes, and deliberate pressure on indigenous lifeways contributed to the catastrophic destruction of the great bison herds. A fuel that had once seemed almost infinitely scattered across portions of the plains became far less available. Settlers turned increasingly to cattle manure where livestock were present. That substitution sounds minor. Historically, it represented a changed landscape. Fuel tells environmental history because people burn what their surroundings can provide. When forests were cleared, wood supplies changed. When bison disappeared, buffalo chips disappeared with them. When corn cultivation expanded, cobs and stalks became more common. When railroads arrived, coal could enter communities from distant mines. When towns grew, fuel became increasingly something merchants sold, rather than something every household personally gathered. The history of staying warm was also the history of economic development. A rail connection could reshape winter life within a few years. Imagine a settlement that had depended heavily on local grass chips and scarce timber. Then tracks approached, a depot appeared, freight began moving regularly. Coal could be delivered in quantities that would have been almost impossible for individual households to obtain before. Now heat could be purchased in concentrated form. A ton of coal represented stored energy transported from another landscape by an industrial system. The household no longer needed to gather every unit of fuel itself. But the work had not disappeared. It had moved. Miners extracted the coal. Railroad workers transported it. Labourers handled it. Merchants sold it. Money connected the household stove to all of them. This was a different kind of dependence. The pioneer burning cow chips relied directly on land and labour. The town resident burning coal relied on wages, markets, transportation, mines, and functioning railroads. Neither system was completely independent. They simply placed vulnerability in different locations. Coal also changed household routines. It could burn longer and more steadily than many prairie substitutes. Appropriate stoves could hold a coal fire for extended periods, reducing the endless feeding demanded by hay or cobs. That must have felt transformative to households accustomed to fast fuel. Instead of opening the stove continually, a person could tend a denser, longer-lasting fire. But coal brought dirt. Black dust travelled. Ash accumulated. Smoke from many coal-burning houses altered town air. Mining created dangers far away from the warm room benefiting from the fuel. Every solution carried costs. Wood itself was not environmentally free. Growing settlements demanded timber for houses, barns, bridges, railroad ties, fences, businesses, mines, and fires. Groves along rivers could be cut heavily. Scarce trees on the plains became even more valuable as populations increased. That encouraged tree planting. Settlers established windbreaks, shelter belts, orchards, and timber plantings for many reasons. Protection from wind, shade, fruit, building material, and eventually fuel. Planting trees could therefore become a long-term heating strategy. A sapling did nothing for tonight's stove. But years later, pruned branches or mature timber might contribute to the household supply. This required a very different kind of thinking from emergency fuel gathering. The family was investing in future heat. They fenced young trees from livestock, protected them where possible, watched them survive drought, insects, and winter, waited. The frontier landscape slowly changed around permanent settlement. A homestead that had begun as a house exposed to open prairie might, after years of work, stand near planted trees. Those trees interrupted wind. They created shade in summer. They made buildings feel less isolated. And eventually, some produced usable wood. The greatest improvement in fuel security was not always learning to tolerate scarcity better. Sometimes it was changing the farm so scarcity became less severe. A better stove, a tighter house, a larger shed, a planted grove, a more dependable road, access to coal, more experienced children, closer neighbours. Every improvement widened the margin between normal hardship and emergency. This was how many frontier households became less fragile over time. The first winter might involve improvisation. The fifth could involve systems. The 10th might involve resources the original settler could barely have imagined when arriving on open land. Of course, not every family remained long enough to reach that point. Some abandoned claims. Some moved. Some lost farms through debt, crop failure, illness, or disaster. Some communities declined. Pioneer history contains departure as surely as endurance. Survival should not be confused with inevitable success. Yet for families who stayed, one of the deepest changes was almost invisible. Winter ceased to be an unknown enemy. It became familiar work. Still difficult, still capable of surprise, but familiar. And when autumn returned, the family could look at its preparations with a harder-earned understanding. The woodpile was not simply bigger. The house was not simply tighter. The people themselves had changed. They knew what cold would ask of them. And this time, they intended to answer before it had to ask twice. What cold asked of them became easier to answer when the settlement itself changed. The first families in a new area might face open prairie, rough trails, distant timber, and only a handful of neighbours. A decade later, the same place could possess roads, stores, blacksmiths, lumber dealers, churches, schools, and perhaps a railroad connection. Each addition altered the winter equation. A better road did not produce fuel, but it made fuel easier to move. A blacksmith could repair equipment needed to cut or haul it. A general store might sell matches, stovepipe, tools, or manufactured goods that reduced dependence on improvised replacements. A lumber dealer could turn distant forests into local boards and scrap wood. A railroad could bring coal from another region. Settlement transformed individual survival into infrastructure. This process was gradual enough that people living through it might not have described it dramatically. One winter, a family hauled timber from the creek. Years later, someone sold cordwood in town. Later still, coal arrived by rail. The stove remained in the kitchen, but the network feeding it had expanded far beyond the farm. That expansion also allowed specialization. A household no longer had to produce every useful thing personally. Someone cut wood for sale. Someone hauled freight. Someone repaired stoves. Someone sold coal. Someone built tighter houses. Someone manufactured better windows. The frontier economy turned survival tasks into occupations. For families with enough money, this reduced physical labour. Instead of spending a day gathering fuel, a farmer might purchase part of the winter supply and spend that day on work that earned the money used to buy it. The labour did not vanish. It became exchange. This distinction explains why cash could become a winter resource almost as important as an axe. A family with poor access to timber but enough money could buy heat. A family surrounded by fuel but short of food might sell wood. Resources moved between households according to need and opportunity. Yet markets never erased inequality. People with more land, healthier livestock, stronger teams, better tools, and reliable income could build larger reserves. They could purchase coal before prices rose, repair the stove before it failed, buy another blanket, replace a broken window, hire labour for cutting. A poorer household had less room for error. One injured horse could matter enormously. One medical expense could consume money intended for fuel. One failed crop could weaken every part of winter preparation. The difference between comfort and hardship was often not a question of toughness. It was a question of margin. How much could go wrong before the household ran out of alternatives? Families with several fuel sources had margin. Families with relatives nearby had margin. Families with savings had margin. A farm with good shelter, reliable animals, dry storage, and established trees had margin. A newly arrived household with debt and an unfinished building had very little. This is why the first winter became such a powerful symbol in settlement stories. It compressed nearly every weakness into a single season. The house might be unfinished. Fuel sources were not yet understood. Neighbours were unfamiliar. Animals had not adapted. Food stores could be limited. The family did not yet know where snow would drift or which road became impossible after a storm. Experience had not accumulated. The second winter could still be hard, but it was rarely identical. People remembered. They changed things. A door was rehung. Another shed was built. More potatoes were stored. An extra blanket was made. Fuel was gathered sooner. A path between the house and barn was planned, where drifting might be less severe. Small corrections accumulated. That accumulation was one of the quieter engines of settlement. The frontier did not become livable because one generation suddenly became stronger. It became more predictable because thousands of practical problems were solved repeatedly. Some solutions were individual. Others became shared knowledge. A neighbour showed another family how to twist hay. Someone recommended a particular stove. People compared ways of storing chips. A carpenter improved a doorway. A merchant learned how much coal the town would need before winter. Local knowledge moved through conversation. This information could be as valuable as physical resources. A newcomer arriving late in the year might be told immediately where timber could be found, which creek crossing remained usable, who sold fuel, how much hay a stove might consume, which building caught the worst north wind. Advice reduced the number of mistakes that had to be learned personally. Community memory became another form of insulation. The settlement remembered disasters too. A house lost to a stove fire reminded others to check chimneys. A family trapped without fuel encouraged neighbours to build larger reserves. A severe blizzard changed expectations about how long roads might remain closed. Hard winters became reference points. People spoke of them years later. Not every story remained perfectly accurate in retelling, but the practical lesson could survive even when details blurred. Prepare for worse than last year. That advice sounds obvious until preparation competes with hundreds of other needs. Summer and autumn were busy. Fields demanded work. Harvest could not wait. Buildings needed repair. Food required preservation. Livestock required care. Fuel gathering was one item on a long list, and warm weather made winter feel distant. Human beings have always been vulnerable to the illusion that today's conditions will continue. Then the first cold night arrived. Smoke began rising from chimneys. The woodpile suddenly became visible again. Experienced families tried to prevent that seasonal surprise by treating fuel as a year-round concern. Wood could be cut when other work allowed. Deadfall collected during trips for unrelated purposes. Scraps saved. Trees planted. Storage repaired. The winter reserve was built gradually, rather than through one frantic effort. This reduced both labour pressure and risk. It also created a different relationship with the landscape. A fallen branch noticed in June could become January heat. A tree planted this spring might protect grandchildren from wind. A pile of cobs after harvest was already part of the winter stove. The seasons became connected through materials. Nothing ended when its immediate use was complete. Harvest produced food and fuel. Livestock produced work, food, manure, and sometimes fuel. Trees produce shade, wind protection, timber, and firewood. Buildings protected people and protected the resources people would later burn. The homestead was a network of stored possibilities. Firewood was only the most obvious one. This helps explain why the near-empty woodpile, dramatic as it sounds, was not necessarily a sign that disaster was inevitable. An experienced household might have planned for the woodpile to become small. Perhaps the wood had always been reserved for the coldest nights, while cobs and hay handled ordinary days. Perhaps coal remained in another bin. Perhaps dried chips were stored in a shed. Looking at one dwindling stack could give the wrong impression. What mattered was the entire fuel system. The danger began when every branch of that system failed together. Wood gone, hay needed for livestock, cobs exhausted, chips wet or buried, coal unavailable, roads closed, neighbours equally short. That convergence turned inconvenience into emergency. Fortunately, most winter days were not the worst day. A small break in weather could reopen options. Sun softened snow. A road became passable. Someone reached town. A neighbour arrived. Fresh fuel crossed the threshold. The pressure eased. A few ordinary pieces of wood could feel astonishingly valuable after several days of rationing. They were stacked carefully, not burned all at once. Scarcity had taught its lesson. And when settlement eventually brought more reliable fuel, better buildings, and easier transportation, some of those habits remained. Close the door. Save the scraps. Keep the wood dry. Do not waste a good fire. Prepare before the weather changes. These habits outlived the conditions that created them. They moved into family stories, into rural customs, into memories of grandparents who seemed strangely reluctant to throw anything away. Behind that reluctance was often a world in which objects had possessed several lives, and one of those lives might end in the stove. A broken thing could still become warmth. A dry field could still become fuel. A neighbour could still become rescue. And a small reserve, protected for months, could still become the difference between fear and another ordinary morning. By the time modern heating began removing these calculations from everyday life, generations of frontier families had already learned the central lesson. Winter was rarely defeated by abundance alone. It was defeated by options. And the more options a household created before the cold arrived, the less frightening the final pieces of firewood became. And once those options existed, the old fear of the shrinking wood pile did not disappear so much as change shape. The pile could still become small. A storm could still last longer than expected. A stove could still consume more fuel than anyone had hoped. But the household no longer saw the final row of logs as the boundary between warmth and helplessness. There were other answers now. A bin of cobs, a shed of dry chips, hay that could be twisted, coal if the town had access to it, scraps saved from building, a neighbour with a wagon, a better insulated wall, another quilt on the bed, a room that could be closed, a meal that required less fire, a few coals carefully preserved beneath ash. Each answer was small. Together, they were survival. That is perhaps the most important correction to the familiar image of frontier winter. The story was rarely about one heroic person walking into a blizzard with an axe and returning with enough wood to save everyone. Sometimes people certainly did dangerous things because circumstances left them no choice. But most successful winter survival happened earlier and more quietly. It happened when someone noticed dry branches in autumn and brought them home. When a child collected chips before the snow covered them. When cobs were saved instead of discarded. When a door was repaired before the north wind arrived. When a family chose not to burn its best logs during a mild week. When neighbours helped cut wood for someone who was sick. When people accepted that one warm room was enough. The great frontier skill was not enduring suffering after every other plan had failed. It was arranging life so fewer plans failed at the same time, and this required humility. The landscape dictated terms. If there were forests, people burned wood. If there were few trees but abundant grass, they learned what grass could do. If cattle supplied dry manure, manure became fuel. If corn produced mountains of cobs, cobs went into the stove. If railroads brought coal, households adapted again. People did not survive by insisting that the environment provide the fuel they preferred. They survived by using the energy that was actually available. This was especially true on the Great Plains, where settlers coming from heavily wooded regions could find themselves facing a landscape that seemed almost unfinished by their standards. Where were the trees? Where was the familiar firewood? Where were the logs for houses, barns, fences and stoves? The prairie answered with sod, grass, river-bottom timber, agricultural residue and dried dung. Not elegant answers, but answers. And over time, entire styles of domestic life grew from them. Sod houses became symbols of settlement, partly because the prairie itself supplied the building material. Hay-burning stoves became associated with places where grass was more abundant than timber. Buffalo chips entered trail stories because thousands of travelers had discovered the same practical fact at roughly the same moment in their journeys west. The environment wrote itself into household routine. Even language preserved the adjustment. Buffalo chips turned manure into something that sounded almost like conventional fuel. Cow chips did the same. The name made the material ordinary. And once something became ordinary, children could grow up without finding it particularly strange. A child born into a plains household that regularly burned corn or dried manure did not necessarily experience the same psychological adjustment as an adult newcomer seeing those fuels for the first time. For the child, that was simply how winter worked. Bring in the chips. Carry the cobs. Shut the door. Do not waste the kindling. Stay away from the hot stove. The unusual becomes tradition remarkably quickly when it works. Then conditions changed again. Railroads spread. Towns expanded. Commercial coal became easier to obtain in many places. Manufactured stoves improved. Lumber moved farther and more cheaply. Houses became larger, tighter, and more complex. Eventually, electricity, natural gas, heating oil, and modern furnaces would remove much of the daily labour from household warmth. A thermostat condensed centuries of winter calculation into a small movement of the hand. Turn it slightly. The room becomes warmer. The fuel source may be miles away. The machinery may operate automatically. No one in the house needs to know how much material is burning at that exact moment. That convenience creates a profound historical distance between modern life and the frontier stove. For a pioneer family, heat was visible. You could see the reserve. You could carry it. You could feel its weight. A child bringing a basket of cobs indoors knew that the warmth of the evening had substance. Someone had to gather it before someone else could burn it. When the pile became smaller, the future became visibly smaller with it. Modern heating hides much of that relationship. Energy arrives through wires, pipes, trucks, and enormous networks. The household usually experiences only the result. Warm air, hot water, a heated room. For frontier families, the connection between landscape, labour, fuel and comfort was impossible to ignore. Perhaps this is why stories of fuel scarcity remain so compelling. They reduce survival to something wonderfully simple. There is cold outside. There is a fire inside. Between the two stands a pile of material that is slowly disappearing. What do you do when the pile is almost gone? At first, the answer appears to be that you find more wood. But after looking closely at frontier life, that answer becomes too narrow. You might burn something else. You might heat less space. You might cook differently. You might put on another layer. You might protect the remaining fuel from moisture. You might save the best pieces for night. You might ask a neighbour. You might sleep earlier. You might let the room become colder than you would ever tolerate today. You might discover that the thing scattered across the prairie, ignored yesterday, is fuel today. And perhaps most importantly, you remember. You remember next summer how February felt. You remember the empty corner where the wood had been. You remember how long the storm lasted. You remember which substitute burned quickly and which one gave steady heat. You remember the draft under the door. You remember the morning when the last good log went into the stove. Then you prepare differently. That cycle of hardship, memory, and adjustment is a much better explanation for pioneer endurance than toughness alone. People became competent because winter taught them, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally. Every season added another piece of knowledge. Eventually, the family that once feared an empty woodpile could look at the same landscape and see possibilities everywhere. Trees along the creek, grass in the field, cobs after harvest, dry manure in the pasture, scrap lumber behind the shed, sunlight through the window, thick earth in the wall, warmth beneath quilts, hands willing to work, neighbours within reach. None of these things promise comfort. Together, they offered margin, and margin was what kept an ordinary, difficult winter from becoming a catastrophe. So when we imagine a pioneer house late at night, perhaps the fire does not need to roar. Let it burn low. The stove gives off only enough warmth for the room that still matters. The bedrooms are cold. Frost rests against the window. A few pieces of fuel wait nearby, chosen carefully for the morning. Boots sit where they can dry without scorching. The kettle has been moved away from the hottest part of the stove. Everyone has gone beneath heavy blankets. Outside, the prairie is still. The woodpile is almost gone. But the family is not without options. Beneath a layer of ash, a few coals remain alive. They will probably still be there at dawn. And for tonight, that is enough.